By the winter of 1887, the trampoline that ran north from Cutter's Fork through the Selkirk High Country had earned a name no man used lightly. The freighters called it the White Grave. It had swallowed so many travelers that the Hudson Bay clerks had stopped keeping records past November, waiting instead for the long spring melt to reveal what winter had claimed. Owen Fletcher, a 41-year-old fur runner out of the Kootenai lowlands, understood the White Grave better than most as he guided his battered dog Sled across the frozen shelf above Willow Creek. 9 days had passed since he broke camp at the abandoned trading post near Silver Elk Bend, leaving behind the shallow grave of a son he had bargained everything to save from the fever that swept through their cabin the previous fall. His entire remaining life fit into what the sled still carried. 3 surviving dogs from a team of 6. A cracked pine runner lashed together with wet rawhide. A bear hide tarp burned along one edge from a stove accident weeks before. His destination, his sister's homestead beyond the pass at Copper Ridge, still lay another 40 miles through country no man crossed alone in deep winter. But every plan he carried collapsed in a single moment when the northern sky began to change. It did not darken the way ordinary storms darken the horizon. It grew pale, bone pale, a sickly grayish white that pressed down over the mountains like frost breathed against a window pane from the wrong side of the glass. Kaloo, the led dog, halted before Owen touched the reins. That was the first sign. Not the sky, not the strange color, but the animal. The old husky planted her paws in the packed snow and lifted her muzzle toward the north. Her ears pricked forward, then folded flat against her skull. The other 2 dogs stopped behind her without command. Owen felt the stillness a moment later. The wind that had been running steady across the shelf for 2 full days did not fade. It simply stopped, as if the whole valley had drawn a single breath and refused to let it go. He had spent enough winters in the Selkirks to know what that meant. When the mountain air went dead still in December, it was never mercy. It meant the wind was gathering somewhere else, pulling itself into a shape that would return with the weight of every mile it had traveled. Owen climbed carefully from the sled and stood upright in the runners. The storm wall rose across the entire northern horizon, black along the upper edge, gray beneath, and along the ground beneath it, snow was already lifting sideways in long horizontal streams. He had perhaps 2 hours, possibly less. There was no cabin close enough to reach, no trapper's lean to within a full day's run, no line camp along this stretch of the ridge. So he did not shout the dogs forward. He did not whip them into a run he knew they could not finish. Instead, he stepped down into the snow, placed one gloved hand along Kaloo's ruff, and stood quietly until her breathing evened beneath his fingers. Then he looked out across the country around him, the frozen shelf, the ridgeline rising to the west, the timbered slopes stripped bare by earlier winds, and beyond them, the dark limestone bluffs that rose along the far edge of Willow Creek. He was not searching for a cabin. He was not searching for shelter in any ordinary sense. He was searching for walls. And after a long moment beneath the pale, flattening sky, he turned Kaloo west, toward the stone. The first cave Owen reached faced too far north. Its mouth opened directly into the coming wind, and any storm that struck the ridge would pour straight inside like water down a chimney. He passed it without stopping. The second hollow sat deeper into the limestone wall, but the opening spread nearly 20 feet across, wide enough to swallow whatever fire or shelter he tried to build within it. Too much space meant too much moving air. Too much moving air meant death by morning. He kept walking, leading the dogs along the base of the bluff, while the pale sky above him thickened into something almost solid. The third cave stopped him where he stood. It sat low in the limestone face, no more than 8 feet high at the mouth, perhaps 12 feet across, with pale gray walls curving inward beneath a heavy overhang of frozen stone. The floor inside was dry. No ice sheets glazed the entrance. No drifted snow banked against the walls. No fractured shelves loomed above, waiting to break loose in the deep cold. And most important of all, the opening turned slightly southeast, angled just enough that the northwestern wind rolling down off the ridge would strike the outer wall of stone rather than pour directly through the mouth. It was not a proper cave. It was barely more than a wound carved into the limestone by centuries of weather. But Owen looked at it and saw something the mountain itself had already built for him. 3 walls. Already standing. Already frozen into place long before he was born. For the first time since the northern sky had turned that terrible pale color, he felt something shift inside his chest. It was not hope exactly. Hope had left him beside his son's grave months earlier. What he felt now was simpler and harder. The clean mathematical understanding that he might still have enough to survive the night if he could raise a 4th wall before the storm arrived. He turned back toward the sled sitting alone on the frozen shelf and let his eyes rest on it for a long moment. Years earlier, before the fever, before the long, slow ruin of savings and hope and everything else Owen had built beside the woman he had lost the year before their son, he had worked one summer beneath a bridge crew rebuilding the railway trestle at Martin Gulch. The foreman had been an old Finn named Eric Hallonen, a man who had crossed more winters in the northern woods than most men lived years. One night beneath the half-finished trestle, with wind coming down the canyon and snow already beginning to fall across the valley below them, Eric had gathered the crew around a canvas windbreak and lit a small pine tar lantern. He held the lantern near a seam in the canvas where 2 sheets had been sewn together with waxed thread. The flame barely moved, but the thin curl of smoke rising from the wick slid sideways through the seam and vanished into the dark beyond. Eric watched it go and spoke without turning his head. Cold does not kill men. Wind kills men. A room does not freeze at once. It leaks its warmth away one seam at a time. Owen had never forgotten those words, and now, standing beneath the flattening sky above Willow Creek, they returned to him with the weight of prophecy. Wind did not need to tear a shelter apart. It only needed one opening, one seam, one narrow gap where moving air could slip through and carry the last warmth of a body out into the night. Owen looked back toward the sled sitting broken and battered on the frozen shelf and understood exactly what he was seeing. The 4th wall. The sled had been failing for weeks. The right runner had cracked below Elk Antler Crossing and been lashed together twice with wet rawhide that had frozen into rigid knots. The lower cross brace had split during a rough descent through the timber near Silver Elk Bend. The bare hide tarp lashed across the load had already lost most of one edge to a stove fire back at the trading post. A Emptis freighter at the last trapline post had looked the whole outfit over and told Owen plainly that the sled would not survive another 100 miles. Owen had thanked the man and paid for a night's grain for the dogs and kept moving north. He had known the sled would fail. He had simply intended to reach his sister's homestead before it did. Now, standing in the shadow of the limestone bluff with the northern sky turning the color of forged iron, he understood that the sled would not carry him another 100 miles. It would not carry him another 10. But it might still carry him through the night if he had the strength to break it apart and rebuild it into something the wind could not enter. He climbed back up the shelf as the first true gusts began rolling down off the ridge. They came in short bursts, not full wind yet, only the breathing of something enormous still gathering itself somewhere out beyond the timberline. He went to work with the small hand axe he kept lashed inside the sled bed. The forward crossbrace came free first. The iron pins had frozen hard into the wood and refused to yield until he hammered them with the flat of the axe head for nearly 2 minutes with numb fingers. When the brace finally cracked loose, it fell into the snow with a sound that reminded him of green pine splitting in a stove. He worked the rear stanchions next, then the lashings that held the driver's bow to the frame, then the cross members along the base. The cold bit through his mittens and into the bones of his hands within minutes. Blood welled from a split along the base of his right thumb where the axe had glanced off a frozen iron pin. He wrapped the wound with a strip torn from his shirt and kept working. By the time he had reduced the sled to its component pieces, sweat had frozen along the inside of his collar, and the wind had begun to change its voice. It no longer breathed. It was starting to speak. He tied the bare hide tarp across his shoulders like a pack strap. Then began the slow, terrible work of dragging the sled bed across the frozen shelf toward the limestone cave. The distance was less than 100 yards. It took him nearly half an hour. The broken runner kept catching on hidden stones beneath the snow. Twice the whole load pitched sideways hard enough to nearly wrench him off his feet. Kalu tried to help at first, throwing her weight into the harness beside him with the two younger dogs behind her. But a long, low roll of thunder somewhere in the sky above the ridge sent all three of them jerking backward against the lines in blind animal fear. Owen cut them loose before they could tangle the whole rig, and after that, he dragged the sled bed alone. The rope carved through his coat and tore into the skin of his shoulders. When he finally reached the mouth of the cave and dropped the load beside the limestone wall, he stood shaking for nearly a full minute before he could straighten upright again. Behind him, the storm had already begun to close across the ridge, like a slow curtain of iron. Owen dragged the sled bed across the mouth of the cave until the broken planking covered the deepest portion of the opening beneath the overhang. The cracked runners now faced outward like the ribs of an overturned boat washed ashore in snow. The forward crossmember, still lashed to a length of frozen iron, formed a rough beam across the upper edge. It was a poor fourth wall by any honest measure. The wood was warped, the seams uneven, the lashings frozen into shapes that would not tighten. But it was wood, and it stood between the interior of the cave and the storm gathering out beyond the ridge, and for the moment, that was enough. He drove wooden sled pegs through the frozen leather tie-downs with the flat of the axe head, then wedged heavy chunks of loose limestone along the base of the sled bed to hold it steady against the coming wind. He worked fast. His fingers had gone from stinging to numb to something worse than numb, a dull wooden feeling that meant he was running out of time before frostbite began to take the smaller bones. Above him, the bear hide tarp still hung across his shoulders. He pulled it free now and stretched it across the upper opening of the cave mouth above the sled bed, filling the gap between the wagon frame and the limestone overhang. The first real gust struck before he had finished lashing the tarp into place. The heavy bear hide cracked outward with a sound like a rifle discharge inside a barn. The whole makeshift wall shuddered against the limestone. One rawhide tie ripped free from its peg and snapped wildly against the stone with a sharp reptilian hiss. Owen lunged forward and climbed onto the frame of the sled bed while the wind rose around him in a long ascending howl. His right hand had gone almost useless now. He could barely feel the rawhide as he forced the knot back through the peg with the last strength in his fingers. Below him, the cave interior groaned with the moving air pouring through the still open seams, and for one brief moment, balanced above the dark opening, with the storm bearing down across the ridge from the north, Owen understood exactly what would happen if he could not finish sealing the shelter before the full weight of the blizzard arrived. The cave would stop being a wall. It would become a funnel. Wind would pour through the open seams, accelerating as it passed through the narrow channels, tearing warmth from his body and from the bodies of the three dogs faster than any of them could replace it. They would freeze standing upright, or freeze in their sleep, or freeze curled beside each other in that final, terrible warmth that comes just before the end. He tightened the knot and dropped back down into the cave interior. Then came the seams. Owen moved along the base of the sled bed on his knees, working now more by touch than by sight, because the light outside had faded into that pale iron gray color that always came before the worst mountain storms. Wind hissed against the sled planks. Loose snow raced along the frozen shelf beyond the cave mouth in long shifting streams. He packed the seams first with the dry sagebrush he had gathered from the base of the limestone bluff, then with strips of frozen moss torn loose from the cave walls, then with wet snow scraped from just beyond the opening, packed hard into the lower gaps where the sled frame met the uneven stone floor. Every gap mattered. Every seam mattered. Every place where moving air might find a path. A thin draft suddenly touched the side of Owen's neck from beneath the sled bed. The cold hit like the flat of a knife blade laid against bare skin. He froze in place and turned toward it slowly. There, along the ground where the frozen shelf dipped slightly beneath the warped wood, a gap no wider than 3 fingers ran along the base of the fourth wall. That single opening was enough. Wind poured through it in a narrow, invisible stream, cold enough to strip warmth straight through wool and skin and muscle. He dropped to both knees and clawed at the frozen earth with bare hands. The ground tore skin from his fingertips within moments, but he did not stop. He packed the gap with wet snow first, then with clumps of moss, then with more snow driven down hard against the seam, the way an old stonemason drives mortar between courses before the first hard freeze of winter. He pressed the whole seam flat against the base of the wood until the draft faded, then vanished entirely. Then he stopped and knelt there in the darkening cave, breathing hard through the wool wrapped across his mouth. No daylight remained. No moving air touched his face. For the first time since leaving the frozen shelf above Willow Creek, the space inside the limestone walls felt separate from the storm gathering just beyond them. Not warm. It would never be warm. But still, and kneeling there beside the packed seams with his hands bleeding into the frozen mud and the sound of the rising wind hammering against the sled bed only inches from his shoulder, Owen understood something the storm had not yet discovered. He was no longer trying to build a shelter. He was trying to build a pocket of air the wind could not enter. He forced himself to leave the dogs outside until the final moment. It was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. The dogs carried warmth inside their bodies. Warmth and breath and moisture, and in a sealed space, every one of those things mattered. He had seen inexperienced trappers seal their teams inside snow shelters too early and wake in the morning to walls streaming with meltwater that refroze into killing ice the moment the fires died. He would not make that mistake tonight, so he worked instead on the remaining seams while the storm gathered its full weight beyond the ridge. He wedged bark from a fallen aspen branch into the space where the sled bed met the upper edge of the tarp. He packed frozen moss along the joint where the tarp met the limestone overhang. He worked until the whole fourth wall stood tight and dark against the failing light beyond. Then the storm reached the ridge. He heard it before he felt it. A long, deep roar rolled down from the north like the sound of a freight train crossing an iron trestle far above him in the sky. The limestone overhead seemed to shift slightly beneath the impact, though Owen knew that was only a trick of the ears in an enclosed space. He turned back toward the cave mouth and called the dogs. Kalu came first, slipping through the narrow opening he had left along the eastern edge of the sled bed. Her ears lay flat against her skull. Her flanks trembled visibly beneath the thick winter coat. The two younger dogs came in behind her, one at a time, their eyes wide and white, rimmed with the animal fear that comes when weather turns against warm-blooded creatures who understand storms better than any man ever will. Owen guided each of them to the back of the cave. Kalu pressed herself against the limestone wall at the deepest point of the cave and lay down slowly, folding her legs beneath her with the practiced economy of an old animal that had survived many winters. The two younger dogs crowded against her flanks, seeking her warmth and the older animal's steadiness. Owen watched them for a moment, then turned back to the fourth wall and sealed the last opening behind them. He wedged the final chunks of limestone against the base of the sled bed along the eastern edge, then packed wet snow into the last narrow gap where he had guided the dogs through, then pressed frozen moss into the seam above until nothing remained of the opening but a dark line barely visible in the failing light. When he stepped back and turned to face the interior of the cave, the shelter was complete for the first time. Not strong, not beautiful, not the sort of shelter any Hudson Bay clerk would have entered on a record as adequate winter quarters, but closed. And in the sealed pocket of still air, beneath the limestone overhang, the sound of the three dogs breathing slowly filled the darkness like the last small proof of life left anywhere along the northern ridge. Owen lowered himself against the back wall of the cave beside Kalu and let his head rest for a moment against the cold stone. Outside, the storm reached full strength. The change came in a single moment. One instant there was pressure building beyond the limestone. The next, the whole ridge seemed to absorb a violent impact that rolled through the stone beneath his back like the collision of two iron rail cars in a switching yard. He never actually saw the storm. Inside the sealed darkness of the cave, he heard it instead. A long ascending roar swept over the ridge, and crashed against the fourth wall hard enough to shake loose fine grains of frozen dust from the limestone ceiling. The bear hide tarp snapped wildly overhead. Wind hammered the sled planks in heavy pulsing bursts that sounded almost alive, as if some enormous creature were pressing its shoulders against the fourth wall and testing its strength. Snow dust began forcing itself through the smallest seams in thin white streams, twisting through the darkness of the cave like smoke rising from unseen fires. The pressure against the shelter became something Owen could feel physically, not cold alone. Weight, the wind pushed against the sled bed with such force that he could feel the frame trembling beneath his back where he leaned against it. Kalu jerked once beside him and pressed harder into the corner of the cave. The younger dogs whimpered softly, then went silent. Outside, the storm screamed across the mountain like nothing Owen had ever heard in 20 years of winter travel through the Selkirk High Country. Inside, the cave groaned beneath the strain, but the sled bed did not move. The limestone walls held steady. The bear hide tarp stayed anchored beneath the overhang, and slowly, listening to the wind search along every seam and corner of the fourth wall, Owen understood something about the blizzard that most men who died in mountain storms had never truly understood. The storm was not trying to break the walls apart. It was trying to find a way inside. It probed. It tested. It searched along every crack and joint and lashing and seam with the patience of something that had swept across these mountains for 10,000 winters before Owen was born and would sweep across them for 10,000 more after he was gone. It did not need to defeat the shelter. It needed only to find one opening. The temperature inside the cave kept falling. Owen could feel the cold settling deeper into the limestone beneath him and creeping slowly through the soles of his boots, through his coat, through the stiffening muscles of his hands where the split along the base of his right thumb had frozen shut with dried blood. Frost gathered along the sled planks where the wood met the limestone. Kalu's breath drifted through the darkness in slow white clouds that faded within inches of her muzzle. But the air itself had changed. The violent movement was gone. That single fact was what mattered. Owen had seen freight men freeze along mountain traces before. He had seen trappers found in their own sleeping bags 3 days after storms passed, curled tight as unborn children beneath robes that should have kept them alive. Most people who had never crossed the high country in winter imagined that death came from cold alone, from some final failure of blood or breath in the terrible temperatures of a January night. But it did not. Men died when moving air stripped warmth from their bodies faster than blood and muscle and food could replace it. That was the true killer along the northern ranges. Not winter. Wind, and now the blizzard still screamed somewhere beyond the buried seams of the fourth wall, but it no longer moved through the cave searching for skin and breath to carry away. The packed seams held tight beneath the pressure of snow and stone. The pocket of trapped air remained still around them. And slowly, sitting there in the deep darkness beside the warm flanks of the 3 dogs, Owen understood that Eric Halonen had been right all those years earlier beneath the half-finished trestle at Martin Gulch. A shelter did not survive because it stayed warm. It survived because the wind could no longer move through it. The longest part of the night began after the initial impact of the storm had passed. Not because the blizzard weakened, because it kept changing. A shrieking gust suddenly whipped across the ridge above the cave and struck one of the upper seams with a sharp cracking sound. Freezing air poured through the gap in a thin punishing stream that raked across the back of Owen's neck within seconds. He climbed to his feet in pitch darkness, feeling for the sled frame with hands gone nearly stiff from the cold. He found the loose knot where the bear hide had pulled free from its peg and forced it back through the leather with the last strength in his fingers. The knot slipped twice before it caught. Below him, Kalu whined once and pressed herself harder against the corner of the cave. Then another thunderous gust rolled over the ridge, and one of the younger dogs bolted upright and struck the sled bed hard enough to send a shudder through the entire fourth wall. A ribbon of snow dust suddenly swept across the floor of the cave, a narrow white stream of ice cold enough to burn exposed skin. Owen dropped back down onto his hands and knees and tracked the draft through the darkness by feel alone. He located the leak near the base of the wall where the young dog had struck the frame, and he shoved packed snow into it first, then frozen moss, then scraps of leather cut from his own boot lacings, forcing them deep into the gap the way a shipwright drives oakum between the planks of a hull before the vessel meets the sea. Outside, the blizzard kept hammering the ridge, but slowly, something strange began to happen. Instead of finding the seams and slicing through them, the wind battering the limestone was packing snow and ice into the gaps. Layer by layer, the storm was sealing the fourth wall shut on its own. What should have destroyed the shelter was slowly reinforcing it. Owen leaned back against the limestone and listened to the process happen around him. The wind found each seam, pressed against it, drove ice crystals into the crack, and moved on. The next gust arrived seconds later and pushed those crystals deeper into the seam. The gust after that packed them tighter still. It was slow work, but the storm had all night, and it was working on his behalf now, without knowing it. At one point, the cave shook so violently that Owen wrapped both arms around Kalu's ruff and pulled the trembling dog tight against his chest, while the wind shrieked over the ridge in one long, unbroken howl that seemed to last a full minute. The younger dogs pressed themselves against his legs and pushed their muzzles beneath the edge of his coat. He could feel the tremors running through their bodies. He could feel his own heartbeat against Kalu's shoulder. And somewhere in the middle of that terrible howling, Owen realized he was speaking. Not loudly, not in any words the dogs could understand. Just the low, steady sounds a man makes when he needs to hear his own voice inside the darkness to remember he is still alive. "Easy now," he said quietly. The words came out before he understood where they had come from. His wife Miriam had said them every winter morning, brushing frost from the harnesses beside the kennel behind their cabin in the Kootenai lowlands. Back when they still had 6 dogs and a son, and the small, ordinary life 2 people built together in a country that did not care whether they succeeded or not. "Easy now," she used to say to the dogs while she worked. The memory passed through him and disappeared as quickly as it had come. Gradually, the storm eased its grip. Kalu's breathing slowed beneath his hands. The younger dog stopped trembling and settled against his legs. Owen closed his eyes for a moment. Hours passed beneath the limestone overhang. Owen could no longer measure time by anything but sound. The endless roaring outside had dulled around the edges. The force of the wind battering the shelter weakened. The bear hide tarp no longer snapped so violently overhead. And little by little, he began to realize that the massive drifts piling up outside the cave had risen high enough to swallow nearly the entire fourth wall from base to overhang. What should have buried him alive had instead become his shield. The immense weight of packed snow pressed against the sled bed from the outside now, forming a heavy insulating barrier that completely choked off the freezing drafts along the lower seams. The storm had essentially sealed the cave into a thermal cocoon. The sounds of the blizzard grew strange and distant, muffled beneath the heavy snowpack building against the fourth wall. The cave no longer felt exposed along the northern face of the ridge. It felt buried deep inside the mountain itself. Somewhere in that pitch-black stillness, beside the steady warmth of the 3 dogs breathing against his chest and legs, Owen grasped the final truth about the shelter he had built. He had not defeated the storm. He had simply reshaped his small piece of the world so that the storm was forced to slide around him instead of slicing through him. He had made himself into a small, still place in the middle of a moving world. And the moving world, for all its terrible strength, could not enter a place that had become truly still. He did not know when he finally slept. He woke slowly, into the sound of Kalu shifting somewhere beside him in the darkness and into the absence of the storm. Not complete silence. The mountain still creaked now and then beneath the weight of the drifts pressing against its stone face. Wind still moved faintly somewhere far above the ridge, in the high country above the timberline. But the great roaring violence was gone. It sounded like the world after something enormous had already passed through it and left only the wreckage behind. Owen sat up carefully and reached out through the black. His hand touched sled wood first, then frozen bear hide stiff as sheet iron, then the limestone wall behind him. Everything was cold. Everything was rigid. But everything still held. Kalu's flank gave off slow, steady warmth through her thick winter coat. The two younger dogs lay curled against his legs, breathing evenly. Frost drifted from their nostrils in soft white clouds that faded into the darkness above them. Owen pulled a strip of dried caribou meat from an inside pocket of his coat and chewed it slowly. The meat had frozen nearly hard as pine bark. He worked it soft against his teeth and swallowed it in small pieces, then took a mouthful of water from the small tin canteen he had kept inside his coat through the night so that it would not freeze solid against his ribs. Then he sat still and listened again. No howl, no hammering wind, nothing searching along the seams anymore. In the exhausted quiet beneath the mountain, Owen realized this was the first night since his son's death that he had slept without dreaming of the fever cabin, of the small hand that had gone still beneath his palm in the last dark hour before dawn, of the sound of his own voice breaking against the walls of a house that no longer had anything alive inside it but him. He sat there in the darkness for a long time, breathing slowly beside the warm bodies of the three dogs. And he did not weep. He had done all of his weeping months earlier beside a small grave dug into frozen ground beside a river that never fully thawed. He simply sat there and breathed and understood, without any words for it, that he had survived the night. A thin line of pale light finally appeared along the frozen upper edge of the bear hide tarp. Owen stared at it for several seconds before he understood what it meant. The storm had passed. He pushed himself upright slowly, joints stiff from cold and exhaustion, and began to dig at the packed drift, sealing the shelter shut. He worked first with his bare hands, then with the flat of the axe head, then with a broken sled slat he pried loose from the fourth wall. Snow collapsed inward in hard white chunks. Cold air spilled through the widening opening, but it came without violence now. When Owen finally crawled out from beneath the limestone overhang, the world outside looked erased. The frozen shelf above Willow Creek was gone. The sagebrush flats had vanished beneath smooth white drifts that ran unbroken from horizon to horizon. Even the ridgeline seemed softened, curved into pale, rounded shapes beneath the depth of new snow. Nothing moved. Kalu climbed out behind him a moment later, the two younger dogs following at her heels. The old husky stopped beside the buried shelter and breathed into the frozen morning. The white cloud hanging from her muzzle stayed suspended in the motionless air like smoke from a chimney with nowhere to go. Owen stood beneath the pale sky and felt something strange for the first time in many months. The cold was still present, but it was no longer chasing him. He turned back toward the cave beneath the limestone overhang. The shelter had nearly disappeared. Snow had buried the sled bed almost to the top edge of the fourth wall. The bear hide tarp had frozen stiff against the drift, until it looked less like leather and more like another layer of pale stone sealed onto the mountainside itself. Every seam had vanished beneath packed snow. From 20 feet away, no traveler would have recognized it as something built by human hands. It looked like part of the ridge, a dark seam in the limestone half swallowed by winter. Owen stepped closer and rested one gloved hand against the frozen wood. The plank felt solid beneath the ice. He remembered the empty freighter at the last trapline post, laughing softly beside the corral and calling the sled a wreck waiting to happen. He remembered his son, before the fever, riding in the sled bed one bright autumn morning with a blanket pulled up to his chin while the dogs trotted through falling yellow leaves along the creek behind their cabin. Now that same wrecked sled stood buried beneath snow after surviving a blizzard strong enough to kill stronger men in better outfits all across the northern country. The broken thing had held. The broken thing had become the wall between life and death. Owen stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then he lowered his hand from the frozen wood, called the dogs to him, and started south through the white silence toward the pass at Copper Ridge. It took him 5 more days to reach his sister's homestead. The storm had rewritten the country behind him. He passed abandoned trap sleds half buried in drifts, and once, in the shelter of a burned pine, he found a lead dog frozen upright in its traces, muzzle lowered to the snow as if still searching for scent. Twice he crossed the tracks of recovery teams, hauling bodies down from the higher country toward the settlements below. When he finally rode into his sister's yard near dusk on the fifth day, his coat was stiff with frozen snow and frost covered his beard to the collar. His sister stepped out from the cabin and stopped walking the moment she saw him. Not surprised. Stunned, like a woman watching someone climb back out of a grave already closed in her mind. Inside the cabin, with the stove ticking softly through the iron seams, Owen explained the shelter piece by piece. The limestone cave, the broken sled, the fourth wall, the packed seams, the still pocket of trapped air beneath the drifted snow. His sister listened without interrupting until the story ended. Then she leaned back slowly in her chair and asked the only question that really mattered. How did you know it would hold? For a moment, Owen saw Eric Halonen again, beneath the half-finished trestle at Martin Gulch, watching smoke slide sideways through a canvas seam into the winter dark. Then he looked toward the frost still melting from Kalu's coat beside the stove and answered quietly. It didn't need to be strong. It only needed to be closed. The story of Owen Fletcher was never really about a sled or limestone or even winter survival in the Selkirk country. It was about what remains after a life has already begun coming apart. A cracked runner. A burned tarp. Savings drained away beside a small bed that medicine could not save. The storm did not care whether his walls were beautiful. The mountain asked only one question. Can the wind get in? That night beneath the buried ridge, it could not. And that was why the blizzard never truly found him.